Welcome back to Monster Tamer, a 2D Pokemon-like RPG created Phaser 3. Previously, we worked on updating our level data in Tiled to include new properties for allowing us to pick up items in our game. If you missed the previous videos, there'll be links in the video description to the source code up to this point, as well as the complete source code for this video. There'll also be links to previous videos if you'd like to catch up, so let's get started. So now that we've updated our level JSON file to go ahead and have a new layered for our items, the first thing we need to do in our code is we want to make sure we go ahead and import that new file into our assets and then our data folder under level.json. And then what we'll need to do next is we're going to need to go ahead and parse this data inside our world scene. So I'm going to go ahead and do some jump over to my world scene. And what we're going to do first is we're going to go ahead and add a new tiled property to keep track of the fields that's on this object. And so I'm just going to call this tiled, and I'm going to call this item property. And then we're going to go ahead and change this to go ahead and be item ID. And this will be item underscore ID. And then it'll be ID. And we'll have ID. All right, and then so next what we'll need to do is we'll actually need to go ahead and parse this data from our JSON file. And so I'm going to go ahead and go down to where we create our NPCs in our create method. And so right above where we create our NPCs, what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and create our items. And so I'm just going to add a comma. I'll do create items and collisions. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to call a new method, kind of like what we did with our NPCs. We'll do this, and we'll make this private. I'm just going to call this create items. And we'll go ahead and pass in our map data. So then what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to come down to our create NPCs method. And I'm going to go ahead and just copy this top part of our code here. And we'll go ahead and come down to the bottom of our class. We'll go ahead and add that in. And I'm going to change this to go ahead and be our create items. For our create items method, what we're going to want to do is we want to go ahead and parse our tile map. And we want to find our object layer that's tied to our items. And then what we'll need to do is for our items, we need to grab our objects. And we'll want to make sure our objects have the properties that we expect in our game. So what we'll do first is let's go make a new variable. And we're going to just do const item object layer. We're going to set this equal to map.getObjectLayer, and we're going to go ahead and pass an item for our layer name, and then we're just going to add a safety check. So if our item object layer is not defined, we'll go ahead and return early. And if it is defined, now we want to go ahead and grab our objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do const items is going to be equal to our item object layer, and we want to grab the objects from this. And now what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and validate each item. So we'll do const, we'll do valid items, we're set it equal to our items array, and we want to go ahead and filter our array to only include the objects we expect. And so we'll have our individual items, and for each of our items, we only want to return if our item has an X property, if it doesn't equal undefined, and if our item.y property does not equal undefined as well. And so for our items, this is primarily, we only need our X and Y position for where to place them in our game. All right, so then for each of our valid items, what we'll want to do is we'll want to grab each of our properties from our items, and we'll want to go ahead and do something with them. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to just do a for loop, and we'll do for const tiled item of our valid items. So we're going to grab our item ID, so which item we want to go ahead and give the player when they pick this up, and then we need to grab the ID of this item so we can remove it from our map. So I'm going to do real quick. So I'm going to go up to where we create our NPCs, and I'm going to go ahead and just copy one of these blocks of code here where we grab our property. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste it down here. And I'm going to go ahead and change our type. So for our IDs, they're going to be numbers. And so I'm just going to change this to a number. And instead of NPC frame, I'm just going to call this item ID. And then for our properties, we want to go ahead and do our tiled item properties. And then our tiled item property, and we want to grab our item ID. And then we're going to go ahead and remove our default, and we're going to expect our value to exist on it. So then what we do is we're going to go ahead and copy this block of code here. I'm going to go ahead and paste it, and we're just going to change this to be ID, and we'll change this to be ID as well. So then with our two new properties, I'm just going to go ahead and do a console log for the time being, and so we can make sure our data is coming through how we expect. And so I'm just going to log our ID followed by our item ID. All right, so when we save, our game should go ahead and refresh, and what we should see in our console is we should see two log statements. And so we should see that we have our two items that we added to our map data, and we should see that we have ID 1 and 2, and they're both tied to our potions. So now that we actually have our data from our tiled map, what we need to do is we need to create an object to actually represent these items in our game. And so to do this, we'll go ahead and create a new class called item, And we'll go ahead and create an instance of this for each of our items we pull from our tiled map data. And then what we'll do is in our world scene, we'll go ahead and add an array to keep track of all of our item game objects we've added. And then that way we can clean them up as the player picks them up in our game. So to go ahead and do this, what we'll do is let's come to our code. We're going to go ahead and come to our source and let's go into our world folder. We'll make a new file and we're just going to call this item.js. And so inside here, we're going to go ahead and create a class. Let's do export class and we'll export out class item. And then what we'll do is let's add our constructor and we're going to expect a configuration. And so I'm just going to go ahead and throw in a type real quick here. So for our param, we're going to expect a new type. We're just going to call this item config. And then what I'm going to do at the top of our class is I'm going to go ahead and add in our type definition for our item config. So in our config, the first thing we need is we're going to need our phaser 3 scene. So we need to be able to create our item game object for our game. And then we need to have our position so we know to place that game object in our world scene. And then we'll need our item ID so we know which item to give the player, and then our ID, which is our unique identifier for this particular instance of item. So then what we'll go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and add these properties to our class. And so we'll have a private property for scene. We're going to have a private property for our phaser game object. And then we'll have our ID followed by our item ID. And then we're just going to go ahead and add in our types real quick. And so we'll have type. And so we'll have type of number for both ID and item ID. Our phaser game object is going to be a phaser game object's image. And then for our scene, this is going to be our phaser scene. All right, so then what we'll do in our constructors, we'll go ahead and assign our properties to our values we received in our parameter. And so we'll have our ID is going to be equal to our config ID. Our item ID is going to be equal to our config item ID. And then we'll have our scene is equal to our config scene. And then we need to create our game objects. We'll have our phaser game objects be equal to this, our scene reference. We'll use the add method. And then we want to go ahead and add an image game object. And so for our image game object, we're going to go ahead and do our config position, and we'll grab our X value, and we'll do the same thing for our Y value. And now we need to go ahead and add in our asset key. And so this is going to be our world asset keys. And so this is going to be our tile set for our beach image that we added previously. And from this sprite sheet, we want to go ahead and grab frame 22, which is going to be a generic box that we'll use to represent our items. And then finally, what we want to do is on our game object, we're going to go ahead and set our origin to 0, and then that way it's positioned accordingly. All right, so the last thing we want to do with our class is we're just going to add some getters so we can easily grab these properties. And so we'll do get game object, and we want to return this, our phaser game object. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, I'm going to paste it 3 more times, and we'll update our values on it. So we'll have get our position, we want to get our item ID, and then the ID of this item. And so for our position, we're going to go ahead and return our X value. We're going to go ahead and do this, our phaser game object, our X value, and then our Y is going to be this, our phaser game object, and then our Y value. Get rid of that. All right, and then we want to return our item ID, and then we want to return our private ID. And then real quick, I'm going to add the types to this. And so for our game object, this will be our phaser game object. Our position is going to go ahead and be our coordinate. We'll go ahead and change that. And then for our item ID and our ID, these will be our numbers. So with our new item class, what we'll do is let's jump back to our world scene. And the first thing we want to do is let's come up to the top of our class. We're going to add a new property to keep track of all of our items in our world scene. And so we're just going to call this items. For our type, this is going to be an array of items. So we'll have type, and we'll have item. And so our class item, not our item from our type definition. So we'll come down to our init method, and we'll go ahead and initialize our array to an empty array. So we'll have our items is going to be equal to an empty array. And then down in our create items method, this is where we'll create our items instance. And so we'll do const, we'll do item will be equal to a new item. And for our configuration, our scene will be our world scene. Our position is going to be our X value will be our tiled item. We grab our X value. Our y will be our tiled item, and we want to grab our y value, and then we need to subtract our tile size to account for our offset when we import our data. And then for our item ID and our ID, we're just going to use our properties that we pulled off our tiled object here. And so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our console log. And then for our items, what we'll want to do is we want to push that into our items array. So we'll have our items, we'll do push, and we'll push in our new item. And then real quick, I'm going to jump back to our item class real quick. I'm going to go ahead and move our import to the top of the file, and I'm going to go ahead and fix our import so we have our .js extension. All right, so once our scene refreshes, we should see our item appear on our map. So now that we have our game objects showing up in our scene, what we need to do is we need to give a way for our player to actually interact with them so they can actually pick up the items from our map. So what we want to do is we'll come up to our handle player interaction method, and in our handle player interaction method, we'll come down to the bottom. All right, so what we'll want to do is we need to check to see if we actually have an item nearby. And so to do that, we're going to do similar logic to what we did for our NPC. We need to loop through our items, and we want to check to see if that item's game object's position is the same as our target position here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to make a new variable, and we're going to do const, and we'll do nearby item index. We'll just leave that undefined, and then we'll do const, we'll do nearby item. We're going to set that equal to our items, and we want to use our find method. And so for our item, we want to find the item where our item's x position and y position equal our target position x and y. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an if statement. We'll do item.position.x is equal to our target position x, and our item.position.y value is equal to our target position.y. Then we want to return true. And what we also want to do is we want to go ahead and update our nearby item index to have the index of where we're at in our array. And so we'll do nearby item index will be equal to our index. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and update our method here to also include our index. And we'll come back to that in 1 second. And then finally, we want to go ahead and return false if that item's position does not match. So then after we do that, we just want to add a check to see if there is a nearby item, then we want to do some type of logic. So if there is an item nearby and we're going to go ahead and pick it up, what we need to do is we need to take our item ID and we need to grab the metadata tied to that item ID. So we'll need to use our data utils to get our item based on our item ID. And then what we'll want to do is we actually need to destroy that game object from our scene, so then that way our player can't pick it up again. And in order to do that, we'll need to be able to find that game object in our array. And then that's why we're storing our index. So then we can use that index to go ahead and remove that item from our array. And then once we do that, we're going to want to go ahead and add that item to our inventory. And then that way we can update the number of items we actually have. And we'll want to go ahead and just show a message to the player that says, hey, you found this following item. And just so they know what they actually picked up. So to implement some of that logic, what we'll do is we're just going to do const, we'll do item. We need to first grab it from our data utils. So we'll do our data utils, we'll get item, and we need to go ahead and pass in this scene, and then our item ID from the nearby item that we picked up. So we'll have a nearby item, and we'll pass in our item ID. And now we need to go ahead and do our nearby item. We want to use our game object. We want to call the destroy method, and then that way we can remove that game object from our scene. And now we need to remove it from our array. So we'll do this, we'll do our items array, we'll use our splice method, and we'll go ahead and pass in our nearby item index so we can remove that specific item. And we only want to remove one element, and so we'll pass in 1. And then let's go ahead and just show our message. We'll do our dialog UI, and we'll do show dialog modal. And so for our messages array, we'll just show one message. And so we'll say you found a, and we'll do item.name. All right, so with our changes, we should be able to test some of our logic. So if we come into our scene, if we have our player move, right now we've not added any collision checks for our items, and so our player can actually move through them. And we'll get to that soon. And so then if we approach our item, if we press our space key, we should now be able to pick up our items as, hey, you found a potion, and we clean up that game object from our scene. All right, with that brings this video to an end. In our next video, we're going to work on adding in collisions for our items and our player, and we're going to add in the ability to go ahead and persist our item data to our data manager. So as a reminder, there's a link in the description of the video to the CLI source code for this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. If you did enjoy the video, please consider liking the video and hitting the bell icon to be notified when the next video in the series is released. For more great Phaser 3 content, please see some links on your screen now.